So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Just a phenomenal person, a person who I'm very proud to call my friend and my mentor. I could go on and list all of his achievements, but then we'd be here a really long time, and I'm sure he really would like to start speaking. So Caleb Maupin, could you come up and give our keynote address?
All right, so I want everyone to get up and stretch. Get up and stretch. I do have good news, which is the buffet is after this, and the food here is phenomenal, I gotta say. So after you hear me speak for a little bit, you'll get to eat some really, really good food, and it'll be delicious, and then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll be done for the evening. So wanted to start out with that. As far as all the folks that we honored, I think about Lisa Davis and how Lisa Davis has faced a criminal charge. She was hit with a fine because she organized, allegedly, which she didn't actually organize, she attended a pro-Palestine rally. And she could have just taken the fine and walked away. But they lied, and Uber records showed that they lied, and so she stood up to it. And the way that I know Lisa Davis is because they tried to throw an organization that she's worked with over the years in prison for saying they wanted peace with Russia. And because of that, they were offered every plea deal in the world to just take a plea bargain. But they knew that if that case had set a precedent, that advocating peace with Russia was tantamount to a crime. If they took a plea bargain and accepted a guilty plea in that case, that would be a huge attack on freedom of speech. And so the Uhuru Three stood up, and Lisa Davis was calling me on the phone and inviting me to go to all the rallies. And I admire Lisa Davis, a life of struggle, and what you told about your experience, about the pain and the trauma and the hardship that you experienced at the hands of racism in this country, and your relatives who were killed. It breaks my heart to hear that. And you would be totally justified in just being full of hate. You would be totally justified, but you're not. You're building, you're constructing. And I want to thank you for being here today. Now, Christina Khalil, stand up, by the way. If I mention your name, stand up. Now, Christina, I met Christina at the Hands Off Uhuru Black is Back March that happened a couple years ago. And I started reading about Christina, but even when I first met her, I thought, this girl has a political future. She has an energy and an excitement about her, a commitment. And then I found out that in addition to running for office, Christina Khalil has also worked as a mental health worker, mentoring youth, mentoring adults and others. And so even when she's not doing political work to advocate for unpopular causes and stand up for truth, she's helping people. She's caring for people. It's absolutely beautiful. And so we're just absolutely honored to have you here. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for accepting this award. Thank you for being amazing, Christina. Thank you for standing up and pushing back against all the forces that would try to drive you out of using your voice. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Jessica, I have known Jessica for how many years? When was 2011? How many years ago was that? Somebody do the math for me. I went to the Brecht Forum. Do you folks remember the Brecht Forum? When I first moved to New York City, and they were giving classes on the history of Kenya and the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s against the British Empire. And I sat in this old dusty place with Jessica and a few other people, and we read, I think the book was Imperial Reckoning, and we read Mau Mau from Within, and we learned about this uprising that happened in Britain. And I walked home with Jessica a few times, and I discovered that we were of a similar mind. We took this seriously. And Jessica's background, your family's from Italy, right? And I understand that Italy was a brutal fascist dictatorship, and your family were involved in the struggle for democracy, against fascism, against Mussolini. And so you grew up being interested in anti-fascist causes and anti-imperialism, et cetera, and you have been coming back and organizing year after year after year And I just want to say I'm just honored to have you here as well. So thank you, Jessica. And, you know, in CPI, we do have a policy, maybe people aren't aware, that we don't give awards to members of our own organization, which is good, because if we did, there'd be so many people we'd have to honor. You know, I think about Penny, I think about Briggy, I think about John McCarthy, who just worked relentlessly on the Uhuru case. And I think about so many people in our organization. I think about Noah, I think about Gavin, and I think about so many people. And we're here. We're here because we have the courage to not fall into the trap of red team versus blue team, insult, comedy, hate, tearing people down. And actually, in a second, I'm going to be writing on this board. But before I do that, I do want to thank the people who came to support Holy Mother Han. I want to thank them deeply from my heart, because can somebody hold up that sign in the back? I want people to see that. Now, that is a picture of Holy Mother Han and her husband, her late husband, the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, meeting with Kim Il-sung. And to us, that looks like, hey, okay, they met a famous world leader, they took a selfie. Well, that's a really, really important picture, because the last time, before that photo was taken, that both of them were in North Korea, they were not having a very good time. The last time that Reverend Sun Myung Moon had been in Korea, he was a prisoner, and he was tortured. And he escaped from North Korea, and eventually, in the 1990s, despite all the trauma and all the pain of being held as a prisoner and being locked up, he had the moral courage to say it was in the interest of world peace to go and meet with the man who had imprisoned him, and also to invest millions and millions of dollars into North Korea, with the understanding that if we had trade with North Korea, relations on the Korean peninsula could improve. And that kind of brings me to a point that I have wanted to make, which is that we mistakenly seem to believe that change always comes through conflict, that change always comes through tearing other people down. Noah eloquently spoke about how right now social media is exploding with celebration of political violence, and how toxic that is. And we don't all agree with each other. I look out in this audience, we don't all agree with each other. But yet we're all brave enough to sit in a room with people we don't agree with, to hear some words from people we may not agree with. And we're here, and we're open, and we're unified despite whatever disagreements we have. And I gotta tell you, that's the hope for the future. Not conflict and relentless tearing people down, but openness and reconciliation and love. That's the hope for the future. And I want to thank everyone who was brave enough to come here today, to be with people they might not agree with, to look past the red team versus blue team thing, and to have a conversation. So thank you, and thank you to those who came to support Dr. Hak Ja Han today. Thank you very much. There's a poem I heard years ago, and I actually heard it from an old communist. And it goes like this. On a busy street, in a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down. With a ho, heave, ho, and a lusty yell, the men swung a beam and a sidewall fell. So I said to the foreman, are these men skilled? Like those you would hire if you wanted to build? And the foreman just smiled and said, no, indeed. Common labor is all that I need. For I can easily wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do. So I thought to myself as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measuring life with a compass and square? Am I living my life by a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I that type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down? I heard that poem, and I believe that poem may have Masonic origin, because the compass and square is a Masonic symbol. I don't know where it came from. But it spoke to me at a time in my life when I really needed to hear it. When we talk about the society that we live in, the system that we live in, there are three ways of looking at it. And I could start with Henry Charles Carey. Henry Charles Carey was an economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And at the time, he wrote a very beautiful anti-slavery pamphlet. And in that pamphlet, he described slavery and what it was, and he tied it in with the English system. This is what he wrote. At the time, in the lead up to the U.S. Civil War, he said, "Two systems are before the world today. One looks to exporting men to occupied desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war, and the other to increasing the value of an immense vacant amount of land by importing men by the millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are supported by means of contribution of war that have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other to concentration by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and working the rest of the world down to his level. The other looks to raising the population of the world up to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, and combination of action and civilization. One looks toward universal war, and the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, and the other we may be proud to call the American system. For it is the only one that has ever been devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. And such is the true mission of the United States. Now, that was Henry Charles Carey, the economic advisor to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. He's one of the first voices, from what we understand, that advocated building this Bering Sea tunnel and connecting the United States via Alaska to Russia. And he had an entire vision for doing so, of building infrastructure and the notion that the state with a national bank should facilitate economic growth. And he contrasted that with the ideas of Adam Smith and free trade, and he most especially called out Malthusianism, the idea that the population is too large and that the problem in the world is human beings and that we need to drive down the population. That was Henry Charles Carey. But then you had a guy that some of us have probably heard of, Vladimir Lenin. He wrote a book, made similar arguments. It was called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And he argued that capitalism in the Western countries wasn't just normal capitalism. It had moved into a monopolistic stage with an international financial oligarchy that concentrated wealth in the hands of big monopolies, and corporations were carving out spheres of influence to hold back economic growth around the world. And now, if you go to Russia and you go to China, there's another school of thought that they call geopolitics, where they divide the world not just in the past century, but in the past 5,000 to 6,000 years between civilizations of the land and civilizations of the sea. And they talk about how the Western system that emphasizes individualism is rooted in the fact that the Western countries have a lot of ocean access. Whereas, if you look at the civilizations that have developed on the great world island of Eurasia, whether it's the Persian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, they have a more collectivist way of doing things. That an empire of the ocean can prosper by simply having a mighty navy and controlling trade routes. However, if you're developing and building an empire on the land, you have to build roads, and you have to bring civilizations together. And the reason we think of the East as more collectivist and the West as more individualist may have something to do with the geography on which those civilizations developed. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about the American system or continentalism versus the English system. I don't know if you want to talk about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. I don't know if you want to talk about Eurasianism, continentalism versus Atlanticism. But it's very clear that the system that we live under in the West is in big crisis. And it's in big crisis for the simple reason that human beings are creative creatures. Look, I believe that God is the creator of all things. And one thing that I point to as evidence of that is that I look at nature and I say that ants have been making their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. But in just 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. And the majority of human history was hunter-gatherer civilization, but we got to be too good at it. We innovated, and we got so good at hunting and gathering that we had to develop methods of growing our own crops because there was a scarcity. And that human beings are constantly reinventing their relationship with nature and innovating on a higher level. And that is what defines human beings, is their ability to reinvent their relationship with nature. Friedrich Engels, the Marxist, he said, "The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by his presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends and masters it. And this is the final and essential distinction between man and other animals." That was Friedrich Engels, but you can find that in Genesis. In the book of the Bible, it talks about how man was the species that was given the mission of being fruitful and multiplying and having dominion, and that human beings are unique and defined by their ability to change nature and make nature serve them and reinvent their relationship with nature to get to a higher plane. But yet we're in a time where it seems like people are afraid of economic growth and expansion. Andrew Yang, who ran for president, he was quoted as saying, "All you need is self-driving cars to destabilize society. That one innovation would be enough to create riots in the streets." And we're about to do the same thing to retail workers, to call center workers, to fast food workers, insurance companies, and accounting firms. What sense does it make to have a society where self-driving cars are a bad thing? Shouldn't self-driving cars be a great thing? This chore called driving is no longer necessary. But yet, there's fear that if we had self-driving cars, it would lead to an economic catastrophe. Well, my understanding of why we're in an economic crisis and why we're facing an economic meltdown and why our economy continues to be more and more unstable, I'm going to have to do some math, and those who've watched the YouTube channel have seen this math many times, and I'm going to show you the math that I've learned. Let's say you're making a product, right? You're creating a product, right? Let's say you're making tires. Now, if you're making tires, right, you're going to need the rubber and the materials for which the tire is created, and that's A. And you're going to need to transport the tire to where it's being sold, and that's B. And you're going to need human labor power, human beings, to come together and create the tires, and that's C. And then the total cost at the end of the day is D. Now, what's missing? How is the owner going to make a profit? Now, he can't cut into how the tires are, the material. That's fixed. And he can't cut into the transportation and shipping costs because that's fixed. So in order to make his profit, he has to extract from C the labor value put into it. And it's frustrating because there's a lot of people who talk about this and they say, well, that's unfair, right? They say this is unfair, right? And you know, at the end of the day, you really have C1, which is what the worker is actually getting paid, and then you have C2, which is the profit for the employer. And people look at that and they say, well, it's unfair. It's unfair because the worker is not being paid the value he put into it. He put in C, he's only getting C1. Well, they're missing the point, which is there's a bigger problem than just it's unfair. And then people say, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve compensation? Well, the issue is this. Right? The worker is only getting paid C1, and C1 will always be less than D. The amount of wages paid out in the process of production is never enough to buy back the product that is produced. We have a problem that is a problem that in previous periods wouldn't have made any sense, the problem of glut, poverty created by abundance, where people become homeless because there are too many houses. People become hungry because there is too much food. And this is a completely unnatural problem. And that's why our government buys billions of dollars worth of cheese and buries it in a cave in Missouri to keep the price of dairy high enough. And that's why we have a military-industrial complex, because we have to keep spending money to keep the economy going. And it's this problem, the fact that we are never paid enough to buy back what we produce. And the boom-bust cycle that we understand is rooted in this problem, that eventually the market becomes glutted, right? This is a four-letter word, glut, G-L-U-T, glut. The market becomes glutted, and the prices of all the products goes down, and as a result, you have a situation where people become homeless, and poverty persists due to abundance. And this problem gets worse when there is technological advancement. Why? Well, how can the employer save money? He can do it through what he calls labor-saving technology, reducing the role of C, right? Reducing the human labor power involved in the creation of every product. But the problem is that as C decreases, C2 also decreases. The profit that the employer makes is extracted from the human labor power put into it. So every time you have a situation where the amount of human labor power in a product decreases, you have a falling rate of profit. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. And so as technology advances, and as the role of the worker at the assembly line goes down, as the market becomes more quickly glutted with products, we get more and more of an economic meltdown. And if you look at the history of our economy, great economic crises tend to follow great technological leaps, right? The First World War was preceded by all kinds of great technological advancements that led to all kinds of panics on the stock market that eventually led to World War I. And then, with mass destruction and 20 million people killed, you had the Roaring Twenties. They were rebuilding. And then Henry Ford and Taylor and their innovations of the assembly line created an economic crisis, and you had the Great Depression. And the only thing that cured the Great Depression was a catastrophic event called World War II. And that great periods of economic crisis tend to follow great technological leaps. And this shouldn't be the case. It's not natural. It's not something that we should have. And so, what do we do about it? Well, I think that we need a government that will step in and make sure the economy keeps growing. And we have a 4-point economic plan in CPI, which doesn't seem that radical. 1, hire the unemployed and start rebuilding America. Hire the next generation and put them to work rebuilding our roads and bridges and highways. Full employment, and give this country a high-tech upgrade. Pave the roads, build some high-speed railway, fund fusion energy research. We ought to invest in the infrastructure of America. Step number 2, how are you going to pay for it? Well, this country is very, very rich. We've got a lot of oil. We've got a lot of natural gas. We've got a lot of coal and timber. The wealth, the natural wealth of America should go into the public budget, right? I think that's pretty basic, right? Public control of our natural resources. And step 3 would be the creation of a national bank and public control of banking. You read the Bible, if you read the Quran, you read the Torah, every major religion forbids lending money at interest because it leads to the creation of a creditor class. Money created through usury, wealth created through speculation is sterile. And the understanding is that if we had a national bank that injected credit into communities, we could stimulate economic growth. And that when you have a gambling casino economy where people are making money without creating any value, that leads to a problem. That value comes from human innovation and human creativity, not from speculation. And that's something that people have known for thousands of years, and we've gotten beyond that. And then the final thing, and this is one that there's a lot of confusion about, right? It's something that maybe Mr. Mamdani might advocate, but for very different reasons, which is that, I think that health care should be provided in this country. I think that education should be provided. But the way people often talk about it is it's very pessimistic. It's, my life is unfair, the world is unfair, corporations get lots of free stuff all the time. I should get some free stuff too. Give me some free health care, give me some jobs. And they're not wrong. Corporations do get free stuff from the government all the time. But that pessimistic attitude of resentment, like, oh, it's just unfair, that's not helpful. We should provide health care as an investment, right? If we're going to have a strong country, we need a hard-working population. And that means the people are healthy. If we're going to have a strong country, we're going to need smart people, educated. And that means investing in education. If we're going to have a strong country, we're going to need everybody's human labor power to be utilized. So we should have full employment, and that we should view it as an investment. What we need is a government that invests in people, not a government that invests in wars and prisons and opioids and death. We need a government that invests in the source of wealth, which is human beings and their creativity. Now, that's what I believe. And, 20, 30 years ago, if someone said they believed this, that might make them a communist or a socialist. But not anymore. And in fact, if you go across America, you talk to communists and socialists, they don't think that. I don't know what they think. I mean, to some of them, socialism means giving people health care and giving people free stuff. To some people, socialism means all the white people have to leave America and we return it to the indigenous people. To some people, socialism means we tear it down and we burn it down and the country gets destroyed in an epic battle. And to some people, it means all kinds of different things. It means worker cooperatives, but you talk to all these different groups, none of them can put forward a basic plan to make life better. But I'm going to ask you this. If you're in America and you don't want to make life better in America and you're not putting forward a vision to improve the conditions of the American people, why should anyone listen to you, right? If you're not advocating improving people's lives, if you're just doing this cathartic revenge thing, why should anyone listen to you, right? And I'm going to explain to you tonight what I've spent the last 10 years of my life learning in a very hard and difficult way. Anyone ever heard of Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud, he divided the human mind into 3 parts, right? He said, you have your conscious mind, your thoughts. That's your ego. That's your conscious mind. That's your thoughts. You're thinking, I'm walking down the street, etc. But in addition to your ego, you have your basic bodily desires, right? You're hungry, you have to go to the bathroom, your sex drive, etc. And that's called your id. But in addition to your ego, in addition to your id, you have what's called the superego. And the superego, that's your conscience. That's the part of your mind that is saying you can do better. That's the part of your mind that is urging you to do the right thing. That's the part of your mind that represents the voice of a parent, maybe the voice of a teacher that you look up to, maybe the voice of someone who's mentored you. The superego is the part of your mind that is constantly challenging you to do better. And the superego is the source, according to Sigmund Freud and his writings, of a lot of stress and anxiety because of the fact that it demands the impossible. You will never be good enough for your superego. It's always going to say you could do better, you could be kinder, you could work harder. It's never satisfied. That's your superego. Now, Sigmund Freud also talked about how there are various feelings that human beings have throughout their life, right? One is the drive toward anger, aggression, and sex. That's called the libido. Libido, right? In addition to that, in addition to libido, there's another drive that we all have, which is called transference. The idea to have someone to look up to, like a parental figure. It's called transference. And that we have these various impulses for a reason. For example, libido. Why does libido exist? Libido exists because we have to procreate. It exists because we have to protect ourselves and assert ourselves. So we have within us the drive toward anger, the drive toward reproduction, etc. Transference exists because one of the most basic needs that a child has is for a parental figure to care for them and protect them. And there's another drive, right? And this is called the Oedipal drive. What is the Oedipal drive, right? That's the drive of a young man to kill his father, or of a young girl to kill their mother, right? Why does that exist? Because you need to go out on your own, right? It's part of growing up. You need to go out on your own and create your own life, right? And that these are all basic impulses that human beings have that serve a purpose. But I'm here to tell you that the reason leftism and socialism and communism have gotten so weird is because, as a political movement, those kinds of politics embraced libido and Oedipal drives. The word left and right, the terms left and right, go back to the French Revolution. After the king was overthrown, the people who supported the revolution, they sat on the left, and the people that were still loyal to the king sat on the right. And how was it that the emerging capitalist system was able to defeat feudalism? Well, first of all, it was a huge amount of wealth created by colonialism, right, that allowed all that wealth to come into the West. But then ultimately, as a new class of merchants was coming in, the new class of merchants that came into power unleashed the libido and the Oedipal drive of the population. And they created an explosion of rage and sexual passion and an explosion of desire to kill the parent, right? We know what did they do at the French Revolution. The king was the father of the nation, so they cut his head off, right? And during the French Revolution, the Marquis de Sade urged, he said, to keep the passion of the revolution going, they needed to have naked women on display everywhere. And men would look at these naked women and they would be filled with sexual passion, and that would drive the revolution. And that leftism as a political movement became a movement that was focused on unleashing people's libido and people's edible drive. Now, a friend of mine, a guy I've known for years named George Grunthal is here. George, stand up. Stand up. Years ago, this guy, he owns a publishing house. Years ago, on your website, Rebstar Publishers, I found a book, and that book was called Freud and Marx, A Dialectical Study. And it was written by a guy named Reuben Osborne. And this guy was a Freudian, and he was trying to find common ground between Marxist ideology and the ideology and the teaching of Sigmund Freud. And I read that book, and I learned a lot from it. And at the end of the book was written in 1936, 37, around that period, the 1930s. At the end of that book, Reuben Osborne points out they had a big problem at the time, because fascism was the primary threat. And Reuben Osborne points out at the end of that book, and at the end of a follow-up book that he wrote called The Psychology of Reaction, that there was a big problem, which is that fascism was appealing to people's much healthier impulses. It was appealing to those impulses to do evil, to get them to do evil things, but it was appealing to feelings that people have that are very natural, like loving their country. He points out that loving one's country is about as normal as loving your parent. Why do they call it the fatherland or the motherland, right? And it's just kind of natural. Wherever you were born, you have a natural attachment to that part of the world. And it's just natural. It's just built in. And fascists, Hitler and all of that, were appealing to people's love of their homeland in order to build their movement. Whereas communists were appealing to people's libido and their Oedipal drive. And that to a lot of people in Europe at the time, communists, that seemed to love every country but their own, right? That seemed to be repulsed by any form of patriotism. Why, they looked to a lot of people like the kind of person who would love and be interested in every woman but his own wife, right? And that there was this weird desire to appeal to people's libidinal and Oedipal drive. And in doing so, they were creating a movement that was unstable. And in order to defeat fascism, the Communist movement altered its messaging. And this is actually a picture of the Communist Party's convention that they had in Madison Square Garden in 1939. As you can see, that's Abraham Lincoln. And it says, friendship between the peoples of the USSR and the peoples of the USA. And Abraham Lincoln was the father of the country. And this isn't about revenge. This isn't about tearing things down. This isn't about, punishing people. This is about loving your country and wanting to defend its democratic traditions and the struggle against slavery. And that was how they built the movement that aligned with President Roosevelt, that aligned with Britain, and largely defeated fascism. And you ever read a Superman comic, right? Superman, the first Superman comic ever, this is one of the earliest ones, it's not the first one. The first Superman comic ever published was in 1939. Two brothers who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, they decided to come up with a whole new superhero, and his name was Superman. And the first thing that Superman ever did was rescue a group of striking workers from their crooked boss who had put them in danger. And Superman was always going around opposing racism. And he said racism is un-American, and he actually fought the Ku Klux Klan. And he said that truth, justice, and the American way meant we had to oppose racism. And nowadays, that might sound like, oh, we hear that all the time, but at the time this was published, Jim Crow was still in effect all over the South. And so the Superman comics, they were wildly popular. Does anyone know how you say man of steel in Russian?
Stalin.
Yeah, Superman was Stalin. And Superman was saying we need to defeat fascism, we need to be loyal to our country, we need to oppose racism. But when you look at a Superman comic, you don't feel a desire to go out and punish people and have rage and vengeance. In fact, if anything, you get almost feelings of transference, right? Superman is a caring, protective figure who's there to fight for what's right, who's there to challenge you to do better and fight for what's right. Superman is appealing to transference. It's creating a superego. It's a different appeal. And that really what it gets down to, and I wrote a book about this, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, is the falling out between Trotsky and Stalin was about the fact that Trotsky wanted to have permanent revolution. He wanted to kill every last king and invade Europe and kill and death, and he appealed to those libidinal and Oedipal desires. Whereas Stalin realized that if he was going to hold this new country, the Soviet Union, together, they couldn't do that. And Stalin, on the other hand, built a movement that was about 5-year economic plans and mobilizing the country to industrialize.
Stalin set a task: build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol.
The global communist movement was starting to shift in the late 1930s to appealing to much healthier impulses that human beings might have. And it was changing. But then what happened, right? Stalin died, and Stalin's successor, Khrushchev, took a dump all over Stalin and said he's a mass-murdering dictator, he's evil, and appealed to people's desire for revenge, their desire to tear down a powerful figure. And Khrushchev undid and demoralized the Soviet public, telling them that Stalin was just as bad as they'd been told. And as a result, there was widespread demoralization, and China cut its ties with the Soviet Union. And you can really trace the end of the Cold War back to Khrushchev coming in and giving that secret speech and just tearing down the figure who had been the superego in the fight against fascism. I'll tell you about something weird, right? And some of my Russian friends might not like me talking about this, and I'll just say this is not the position of the Russian government. It is not the position of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church opposes this. The Russian government opposes this. But if you go to Russia, and if you go to Georgia, and if you go to former Soviet countries, one thing that you will see is that there are a layer of people who really do believe that Stalin was a Christian, and that there are icons of Stalin with a halo around his head. That doesn't make any sense, right? Stalin was an atheist, right? The Russian Orthodox Church says he was an atheist. The Communist Party and all of them said he was an atheist. But yet there is widespread belief that Stalin was a Christian because he'd gone to seminary school and because he was seen as holding the country together. And there's even legends about angels that fought the Nazis in the Second World War. There are veterans of the Second World War who swear they saw angels come down from the sky and strike down Nazi tanks. And that it's interesting because in Russia today, Lenin is not very popular. Lenin is viewed as somebody who gave up territory. Lenin is viewed as somebody who brought civil war and chaos. But Stalin is very popular. Stalin is seen as a transference figure, as a superego who held the country together. It's very, very interesting. And when we talk about dialectical materialism, that's an ideology that is based on libidinal and Oedipal impulses. That's an ideology that says change can only come through conflict, right? Whereas, if you look at movements around the world that have been successful, that have held nations together, they tend to appeal to people's superego. They tend to appeal to people's desire for transference, to be cared for. And that can be difficult because that superego demands the impossible. That superego is never satisfied. From a young age, I learned to look things up. And my mother was very religious, and I got interested vaguely in the idea of some kind of utopian world, the idea that we could build a better world without suffering and injustice. And everyone said to me, Caleb, that's communism. And communism just failed everywhere it's ever been tried. You can't do that. You know, the Soviet Union fell. Everywhere they've ever had communism, everyone has been starving and miserable. And I assumed that was true. And then one day I came across some economic statistics that talked about how the Soviet Union had built the world's largest power plant. The Soviet Union had built the largest steel industry in the world, how they invented space travel. And I thought, well, this can't be true. Because what everybody knows about communism is that it just failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And I looked up those statistics, and I fact-checked them, and I saw that wasn't true. And I filled with anger at that point because I felt like I'd been lied to. And so as a teenager, I got very, very interested in communism and socialism. because I felt like they had lied to me. They had told me that communism just didn't work, that the Soviet people had all been starving, and it was socialism and communism that made the USSR into a superpower. It's socialism and communism that made China the rich and prosperous country it was today. So I got very, very angry, and I felt like I'd been lied to, and I also didn't appreciate how people would acknowledge I was right, but would just change the subject. They would say, well, okay, that's true, but what about? And I would say, no, not what about. They've told you that communism just never worked anywhere. You're saying something that's factually inaccurate. And I was angry about it. And I got involved in different communist groups, and fast forward, in 2015, I was on a ship to Yemen. I was on a ship to Yemen in the Gulf of Aden, and I didn't realize what I'd gotten into. The Iranians had reached out to me and said, can you accompany this humanitarian mission to Yemen? You know, Yemen was being bombed at the time by Saudi Arabia. There were Iranian doctors and Iranian surgeons and others were on this ship trying to deliver medical aid to Yemen. And I was the only American on this ship, full of Iranian doctors and Iranian nurses trying to deliver medical aid to Yemen. And as soon as we got on this ship, Israel announced that our ship was smuggling weapons, which we were not doing. And Saudi Arabia said the same thing, and they said that a strike on the ship would be justified. And I began to fear for my life. And I was on this ship full of Iranian doctors. And before I got on the ship, they said to me, Caleb, you believe in God? And I was like, oh, yeah, I believe in God. Sure. You know. And I got on the ship, and then I was on the ship, and they wanted to know about Christianity. And they were asking, because they were all Shia Muslims. They wanted to know, what do Christians think about Moses? What do Christians think about Abraham? What do Christians think about the end times? And they were asking me constantly. We talked about nothing but religion the entire time I was on that ship. And as I was fearing for my life, I started to have dreams. I would sleep at night, and I would dream about the church that I had gone to vacation Bible school at when I was a child. And I would dream that it was empty, and I was just walking through this church that my grandmother had that was nothing but cornfields. You couldn't see another building around it. And I just dreamed about this, and it was eerie. And I feared for my life. They bombed the port of Hodeidah 8 times in a single day to prevent us from delivering medical aid to the people of Yemen. And all kinds of dock workers died because they were willing to cooperate with this Iranian mission to bring medical aid to the country. And we were forced to unload our ship in Djibouti, and it was proven that we weren't smuggling weapons. But I'll tell you this, when I got off that ship, I was a Christian again. I was a Christian again. And I realized I would never have gotten involved in any of this if it hadn't been for my Christian faith. I was taught from a young age that those who sacrifice and live for the sake of others, those are the highest folks, right? I think, Mao Zedong said, to die for the people is weightier than Mount Tai. Well, Jesus died for the people, right? And he stood up and he challenged the rich and powerful. And I also thought about that poem I'd heard years ago. On a busy street in a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down with a ho, heave ho, and a lusty yell. The men swung a beam and a side wall fell. So I said to the foreman, are these men skilled, like those you would hire if you wanted to build? The foreman just smiled and said, no, indeed. Common labor is all that I need, for I can easily wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do. So I thought to myself as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measuring life with a compass and square? Am I living my life by a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I the type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down? And I thought about those words, and I thought about, I'm an anti-imperialist. But I'm not an anti-imperialist because I want to wreck things or tear them down. I'm an anti-imperialist because I want to build. Gaddafi built Libya into the most prosperous country on the African continent. Russia and China built themselves up into strong countries. I am not interested in wrecking. I'm not interested in tearing people down. And I want to say this, we have a culture now that has developed where people think the only good thing you can do is tear somebody down. The only good thing you can do is expose somebody. The only good thing you can do is call somebody out. That's not healthy. But I think it has a lot to do with dialectical materialism. And I think it has a lot to do with that mindset that one gets from traditional Marxism. But at the same time, That superego demands the impossible. It's never satisfied. It's always saying you could do better. It's the source of a lot of guilt. Sigmund Freud, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, he makes fun of love your neighbor as yourself. And he says you can never literally love your neighbor as yourself. You can never literally be in your neighbor's shoes. You can never do it because you can't feel their feelings. So, if you trying to love your neighbor as yourself, it's always going to lead to guilt. And I think about that and I think, isn't the world a lot better of a place because people try? Because people try to love their neighbor as themselves? Yes, maybe it's impossible, but isn't the world better because people try? CPI has a different vibe. We are all about building and construction, and we're all about connecting people. We're all about love for our country and love for our community. But the only future America is going to have is with the new economy that is rising in the world. The Western system is dying for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And some kind of movement about hate and some kind of movement about tearing things down and wreck our energy is not going to connect us with the new economy that's rising in the world. We need a movement about love and reconciliation. We need a movement about forgiveness. That's the kind of movement that we need. I want to there's two elephants in the room I've got to touch on. First thing first, right? We did not endorse Donald Trump. Let's just be clear about that. We did not endorse Donald Trump. What we did was during the 2024 election cycle, we saw that Donald Trump's campaign had a peace message in it. He was claiming, and he didn't do it, but he claimed he was going to end the wars. And so what did we do? We decided we were going to boost that message. And we got a big banner of Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands, and we said only peace can make America great again. And I called up my friends from Manhattan Family Church, and we got that banner everywhere. And I will never forget the day that Phil called me on the phone. Phil called me on the phone and said to me, Caleb, Trump is going to be at Madison Square Garden tomorrow. We have to get that banner there. And I called up every person that I knew, and I said, we're going to get that banner to Madison Square Garden. And thank goodness for the people at Manhattan Family Church. We got that image there, and it was in the New Yorker magazine, and it was in USA Today. We were boosting the good things that Trump was saying, even though he didn't mean them. And I'll tell you this, if more people had done what we were doing, Trump might be creating peace. If Trump could see that there was a mass outpouring of people that are demanding peace, Trump might have been more willing to listen to it. We were doing the best we could to promote peace. And the other thing I want to talk about, the other elephant in the room I want to talk about, people have touched on this Party for Socialism and Liberation. There was something called the Rage Against the War Machine rally that happened in 2023. It was the most important anti-war rally that's happened in the last 20 years. And what was important about it? It was bigger than any of the anti-war rallies we've seen since the Iraq War days. Why? Because there were Democrats and Republicans there together, right? Garland Nixon, who's here, he was speaking at it. He spoke at it, and Jill Stein spoke at it, but also, Judge Napolitano spoke at it. And we are proud to say we sponsored that rally, and our friend Scott Ritter was unable to be allowed to speak, so we had a reception for Scott Ritter after the rally so he could speak at our reception. And that rally was such a big step forward because it was like this room, people who don't agree with each other coming together and saying we can't have an economy based on war. And the reason that I fume with anger at the Party for Socialism and Liberation is because they didn't just say that we don't want to participate in this rally. They didn't just say this rally, we don't agree with it. They called it a white supremacist rally. And that is a call for violence. We saw what happened after the death of Charlie Kirk, how they said, oh, he deserved to die. So not only could this anti-war rally not be endorsed, they called it fascist. They called it white supremacist. And that is reprehensible. And I can tell you, we look at what's been done to Venezuela, we look at what's been done to Iran. If the Rage Against the War Machine coalition had grown and expanded, and if it had really blossomed, and we'd had even more rallies of Republicans and Democrats together on the streets saying we don't want wars, things would be different right now. And yes, it's negative, and yes, it's negative, but I'll say it. PSL, we have to hold them responsible. That they are more concerned about appealing to the Democrat Party and their desire to cancel and spew hate for Republicans than they are about stopping the wars. And that's unacceptable. I'll tell you a story. And this is why, I really appreciate all the people who are here that may be hearing things that they're not comfortable with, and I can't thank you enough for doing that. I've had my foot in a lot of different places. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Now I live in New York City. I'm building an organization that is, are we left? Are we right? I don't know what we are. We celebrate human growth and innovation. We're promoting positivity, but we want friendship with Russia and China. We're doing something completely new. We're innovating. We were there for the Uhuru movement when they were under attack. We said that this must not stand. We did everything we could to support that case. We're innovating. And I think about what we've done. I remember when I was 15 years old. 15 years old, that was the first time I ever visited a communist bookstore. I was at the communist bookstore. My mother dropped me off and she said, "Do not leave the store. Whatever you do, don't leave the store." So I was in the bookstore and I listened to some of the speeches, and then they said, "All right, we're going out, we're going to sell the paper." And they handed 15-year-old Caleb a stack of newspapers, and they said, "All right, we're going to go out and we're going to sell this newspaper." And I thought, oh my goodness, you got to be kidding me. You want me to walk up to total strangers that I don't know and try to get them to pay me for actual money, pay me actual money for a newspaper about communism? You got to be out of your minds. My family had always been telling me, "Stop talking all this politics, Caleb. You're embarrassing us. Just stop it." And I was very shy. But they said, "No, we do this all the time." And they put me out there on the street, and I sold newspapers. I remember I could barely get the words out of my mouth. I walked up to, you want a newspaper about socialism? I could barely get the words out of my mouth. But I sold a newspaper that day. The first newspaper I ever sold, the guy saw my Letterman's jacket from Orrville, Ohio, saw the O, and he said, "Well, I don't agree with you, young man, but you go to Oberlin College, so I'll buy it from you." He didn't know. He thought I was from Oberlin College, and he bought the newspaper. That's the first newspaper I ever sold. But I sold another newspaper after that. I sold another newspaper after that. And I came out of my shell. And I learned to talk to people, and I learned to walk up to people I'd never met before and engage with them. And I am so thankful that that happened. Because if that hadn't happened, I see some of these young people and where they're at with mental health, and my goodness, thank God they pushed me to get out of my shell. Whatever flaws, whatever critiques we might have, right? I think that was probably illegal, right? I was 15 years old. I wasn't an adult. I certainly didn't get to keep the money. It was probably illegal. But I'm glad that it happened. And that, back to the superego. Sometimes you got to push people out of their shell. Sometimes you got to demand the impossible from people. I heard a beautiful story earlier this year. The story was about a baby lion who somehow mistakenly ended up in a flock of sheep. And it always felt odd because as it got older, it started to realize that, you know what? I'm just not like the other sheep. I'm just not like the other sheep. There's something different about me. And the story goes that one day the shepherd took this sheep that wasn't a sheep, that was actually a lion, to the river and had it look at its reflection. It said, "The reason you don't fit in is because you're not a sheep, you're a lion. So be proud that you're a lion. Roar. Be proud that you're a lion." I hear that story. It's such a beautiful story. And I really have got to say, as much as I'm not about negativity and as much as we need to build a positive, optimistic movement, I am not here to try and encourage people to be normal. Right? If you think that what I'm saying here is we need to be more normal, we need to fit in, you're wrong. I don't want you to be normal. I want you to be extraordinary. I want you to be high achieving. I want you to go out and do things that you never knew you were capable of doing. I want to challenge you to go out and build. I want to challenge you to go into uncomfortable situations and demand that things change. I want you to be extraordinary. I don't want you to be normal. And I believe that everyone here has a lion inside of them. And that my job as an innovationist is to find that lion inside of you and let it awaken and let it take control. That's what I believe. And that's what I'm trying to do. We need a movement that's about building. We need a movement that's about loving our country and loving our community. On a busy street, in a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down. The ho, heave, ho, and a lusty yell. The men swung a beam, and the side wall fell. So I said to the foreman, "Are these men skilled? Like those you would hire if you wanted to build?" And the foreman just smiled and said, "No, indeed. Common labor is all that I need, or I can easily wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do." So I thought to myself as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measuring life with a compass and square? Am I living my life with a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I that type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down? Well, I'm here to tell you it's time to start building in America. We're going to build high-speed railway across the Midwestern heartland. We're going to build a bridge over the Bering Sea connecting America with Russia and the rising new economy. We are going to build, 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 and we are going to demand the impossible. Dare to struggle, dare to win! Dare to win! Dare to struggle, dare to win!